When Puerto Rico's history is examined closely, it becomes impossible not to notice its gaps, its silences, and its contradictions. The way our history is told from the Taino people to the modern Puerto Rican feels like an incomplete sequence, as if someone had torn entire chapters out of our story. That void is no coincidence. It is the direct result of a colonial project that needed to erase the indigenous continuity of the Puerto Rican people in order to justify the presence of the Spanish government on the island of Puerto Rico. The erasure of the Taino was neither an accident nor a historical misunderstanding. It was a deliberate strategy of the Spanish Empire to uphold the encomiend, essentially the enslavement of Tainos and black people, and to impose itself on the island of Puerto Rico while exploiting its natural resources without paying anything for them. That is why Spain claimed that the Tainos had disappeared. If the narrative insisted that the Tainos had vanished, then any claim to land, rights, or autonomy could be easily dismissed. If it was declared that the Tainos had disappeared, then there were no longer any legitimate owners of the land. In this way, the entire island came under the property of the King of Spain, and Puerto Ricans began paying taxes to live on lands that had always belonged to their ancestors. By denying them their ancestral right to the island, the invaders began charging taxes for the very lands that had always belonged to them. The surviving Tainos were reclassified instead as pardos, or simply Jibaros, and their identities erased as they were no longer recognized as indigenous. Their indigenous features were concealed by claiming they were Spanish mestizos, but the Jibaros were the Tainos who hid in the mountains and survived the Spanish genocide. The Jibaro way of life was dismissed as cultural backwardness, and their very existence was hidden in official documents. That is where the historical void upon one that we still feel today. From that erasure also came the forced transformation of the Jibaro figure. The authentic Jibaro was not some cartoonish character. He was the direct descendant of the Taino who survived in the mountains from the 16th century well into the 20th. He was poor, marginalized, and rural. He spoke with ancient accents, preserved indigenous techniques, and maintained an intimate relationship with the land. He represented resistance, memory, and cultural continuity. But that reality was inconvenient for the colonial narrative. First Spanish, and later American, which needed to sell the idea of a docile, modern, and ethnically governed people. The solution was to turn the Jibaro into a postcard, a white, smiling, clean, and perfectly dressed Jibaro was created designed for tourism campaigns, festivals, and advertisements. A domesticated Jibaro turned into a harmless tradition, disconnected from the real poverty, marginalization, and indigenous roots they represented. Meanwhile, the authentic Jibaro lived without roads, without doctors, and without basic rights. While his folkloric caricature multiplied to project an image of Puerto Rico that served external interests, this is how colonialism operates. It takes away your history, but leaves you with a pretty picture so you won't protest. This manipulation also explains why the bridge between the Taino and the modern Puerto Rican was intentionally severed. Most Puerto Ricans descend from Tainos, who sought refuge in the mountains, from Jibaro campesinos, from families labeled as pardos in the colonial censuses, but that continuity was never taught because it disrupted the colonial narrative that Spain and the United States needed to impose. When the people do not acknowledge their indigenous origins, they erase from collective memory their capacity for resistance and survival. And people without memory are much easier to control. The cultural and educational institutions of the 20th century reinforced this deception. The Institute of Puerto Rican Culture in its early years, the Department of Education, through its textbooks, and the government's tourism campaigns, repeated that the Tainos had disappeared, and promoted the idea that the Jibaro was merely a charming figure of the past, more folklore than reality. Meanwhile, thousands of Jibaros were being displaced from their mountain homes to make way for monoculture farming, military bases, and industrial zones. The Jibaros were relocated to coastal housing projects, pushed into even deeper poverty, because in those projects they could no longer farm. As a result, they were unable to work in the only livelihood they had always known. Society in metropolitan areas marginalized them, spreading the idea that they were lazy simply because they needed government assistance to survive. Most of them could not read or write because the government had never provided quality essential services such as hospitals and schools in rural areas. They simply never had the same opportunities as those living in the metropolitan zone. Their culture was ignored by academia, especially their struggle against oppressive governments that sought to erase their indigenous identity to governments that rarely studied them as descendants of the original and native people of this island. Governments that sought to silence indigenous peoples who were persecuted for defending their autonomy and the land that belongs to them by ancestral right. They are the true original inhabitants of Puerto Rico. The governments of the United States and Puerto Rico repressed the Jibaro movements that defended Puerto Rico's autonomy and independence, movements that existed long before the U.S. occupation. During U.S. rule, the independence movements were brutally suppressed, violence, attacks on communities, and mass imprisonment. Yet the official history never explained the reasons behind that repression, nor did it acknowledge who the Puerto Ricans fighting for their country's freedom truly were. The government, along with the press and public officials, called nationalists, subversives, and terrorists. They hid the real reasons behind the fight and the nationalists' strong belief in Puerto Rico's right to govern itself. This turned a fair political struggle into something the government used as an excuse for censorship, silence, and violence. Many Puerto Ricans are unaware that a large number of our national heroes were Jibaros from the highlands, because the history of that people has been intentionally silenced. Everything related to the highland communities and their resistance has been suppressed. When this topic is discussed on social media or videos are created about it, the reach is minimal. The content is made invisible. If this weren't true, then why don't we learn about the bombing of Utuado in school or in our history books? In that event, Puerto Ricans who supported independence were bombed in their own homes by the U.S. government. This is the history of the Jibaros from the mountains, a history that has been purposely hidden, even though it is a crucial part of who we are as Puerto Rico. Another silenced chapter of our history, Jibaro children were taken by the United States government to Native American boarding schools, such as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Virginia, where their identities were prohibited in an attempt to turn them into American citizens. If the Tanos supposedly disappeared in the 1500s, then how can we explain that these children were registered as Native Americans from Puerto Rico? Their existence proves that the Tanos were never wiped out of the island. They survived through the Jibaro and in our mountains. They were forced to abandon their archaic culture, their language, and their customs. They were taught European traditions and made to speak and write in English. None of this was voluntary. These schools were mandatory for all native peoples under U.S. control. The United States had more than 500 schools operating under the motto, "Kill the Indian." Save the man, meaning kill the indigenous identity to save the person. Puerto Ricans from rural areas were also sent there, forced to attend. Carlisle is only one of the hundreds of schools in which there is evidence that Puerto Ricans were present. The other schools have not yet been thoroughly investigated. According to recent research, many indigenous children in these institutions were tortured, and many died during the process of being converted into citizens. The forced removal of their indigenous customs was carried out through abuse and violence. Many of those children never returned to Puerto Rico, and the Puerto Rican government has no record of what happened to them. Their families never heard from them again and could not file any complaints. They were illiterate, poor, rural people with no resources. For decades, the government and historians in Puerto Rico concealed this reality. Only recent research in the Carlisle archives has confirmed that Puerto Rican children were sent there as part of the forced assimilation project targeting indigenous peoples, and that they were victims of that system. Another history that is never taught is what happened during the Ponce Massacre of 1937, when the colonial police carried out a premeditated and brutal operation against Puerto Rican citizens in a peaceful march organized by the Nationalist Party. Despite having official permits from the government, the authorities ordered the march to be stopped and intentionally opened fire on the crowd. The outcome was tragic. 17 civilians were killed. 2 police officers died, and more than 200 people were injured. The people of Puerto Rico were never given an explanation for why the police attacked their own citizens, especially since the march had been officially authorized. The reason behind this repression was simple and forceful: to silence any struggle for Puerto Rico's independence and to send a message of terror to anyone who dared to challenge the authorities. It is part of our history, yet it is neither told nor studied. The Grito de Lars. Born in the highlands of Lars among Jibaro people from the mountains of Puerto Rico. No one talks about the Jibaros of the highlands who, in the 1930s, rose up in protest against the abuses of U.S. industries in the sugarcane fields, with no labor laws to protect them. They were exploited as if they were still enslaved. It was in that struggle that leaders like Pedro Albizu dedicated their lives to defending their dignity and their rights as Puerto Rican workers. It is not taught in schools that the young people killed in the Rio Pedras massacre were Jibaros from the highlands, whom the police executed without trial inside a station. Nor is it taught in history books how the police and the government of Puerto Rico set a trap for the Jibaros of the highlands at Cerro Maravilla solely because they were prone to. Nor is it explained in history books or taught in schools why the FBI, the CIA, and the Puerto Rico Department of State compiled files, persecuted, and marginalized hundreds of Puerto Ricans simply for wanting Puerto Rico's independence. When Lolita Lebron carried out an armed protest in the United States Congress, her action was reduced in official accounts to terrorism, without acknowledging the deeper meaning it held for many Puerto Ricans from the India. That is why official institutions do not even want to mention her existence. She, and many who participated in those movements, came from Jibaro communities in the mountains. Although their struggle was controversial, it emerged from a tradition of anti-colonial resistance and from the feeling of being ignored and oppressed by the system. We can acknowledge that some movements were not always well organized or driven by the right motivations. It is valid to have political, ideological, or religious differences, but we cannot repair the damage done to our history and to the descendants of the Tainos by committing modern crimes against them. That makes no sense. Nor does it make sense to continue hiding our history or ignoring the fact that we still marginalize people from the countryside, especially in the highlands, where they live with fewer resources and services than in the rest of the island. No recognized historian has seriously dedicated themselves to documenting the true history of the Puerto Rican Jibaro and their direct connection to the Tano. As Puerto Ricans, we cannot erase the difficult chapters of our history, nor can we hide the mistakes of the past. Historical memory is not something to be edited for convenience. History exists to be studied, understood, and learned from with objectivity. A people who do not know their past or allow others to erase it are condemned to repeat the same mistakes. The history of the Puerto Rican Jibaro is an essential pillar of our cultural heritage, their resistance, their Taino roots, their music, cuisine, agricultural knowledge, and their entire culture must be preserved and taught to future generations. Restoring the Jibaro to their rightful place in Puerto Rican history means teaching young people the importance of protecting those who safeguard the knowledge of our ancestors and our ancestral culture, because it was in the hands of the Jibaro, not in the history books, that our ancestral culture survived. It was in the mountains of Puerto Rico where our identity and our resilience as a people were safeguarded. We are the sons of the Jibaros of yesterday. As Puerto Ricans, we should acknowledge that. Today, we continue to use a fictional and whitewashed version of the Jibaro as a symbol of Puerto Rico, without recognizing his Taino roots or his role in cultural resistance. Within the Jibaro lies an essential part of who we are. Many Puerto Ricans can trace their family tree back through generations and see that, for centuries, our ancestors were Puerto Ricans from different towns across the island with no external roots. If you take the time to explore your own family history, you may discover the same. This means that many Puerto Ricans, especially those from the mountains, preserve a much stronger indigenous heritage than what has been claimed for decades. The idea that we are all mixed was used to erase identities and ancestral claims. Today, thanks to historical and genetic research, we know that this narrative can no longer stand. That is why Puerto Rico's history feels so fragmented, because many parts of it are not officially told. And many of the things that are officially taught lack historical foundation. It is astonishing that in the 21st century, there is still no widely recognized academic work, book, or documentary that confronts the falsehoods of Puerto Rico's official history. It is time for the people to learn their true history and reclaim the identity that has been hidden for generations. Our cultural heritage cannot be eradicated. It still survives, and it is our responsibility to rescue it and ensure that it does not disappear. The official narrative was built to minimize indigenous continuity, to justify invasions, to whiten the national identity, to hide the resistance of the rural people and erase the authentic Jibaro from collective memory. When someone's history is altered, their identity is altered as well. That rupture explains why so many Puerto Ricans feel a profound disconnection from their origins. But the truth remains alive in the collective memory of our who were the ones that preserved the memory of our indigenous people. In the mountains at the center of the island, where families still live, who preserve customs, agricultural practices, language, memory, and physical traits that trace back to the first inhabitants of Puerto Rico. Re-educating the country about who the Jibaro truly is not an act of nostalgia, it is an act of justice. The Jibaro is not folklore. The Jibaro survived. He is the living foundation of the Puerto Rican people. The voice that carries the rolling are the call that echoes from mountain to mountain, the rooster that awakens the dawn, the harvest, the solidarity, the humility, and the resistance. The Jibaro is the silent guardian of a millennial tradition, and recognizing him means reclaiming our true history. If you've made it this far, subscribe and give it a like so you don't miss the next videos. See you next time.